Hi, and welcome to Discovering Christ, the virtual experience. Ha ha ha! My name is Wes, and I'm a youth minister and an evangelist for St. Andre Bessette Parish in Laconia and for St. Joseph Parish in Belmont. And this actually is my fourth year of doing Discovering Christ. Well, actually, it's my first year of doing Discovering Christ alone in a room to a camera. But with COVID and all the precautions that we have to take, I mean, we're going to give this a shot, right? You see, normally we begin Discovering Christ every session of it together. We share a meal together. We have some time for fellowship and to get to know each other. Sadly, we're not going to be afforded that experience, but we're going to give this a shot. We know that whenever Christ is discovered, in whichever way he is, there's always fruit to be cultivated from it. And I am confident that this virtual experience will bear much fruit. So I'm excited that you've decided to join us, and please spread the word. And let's begin. So we usually begin our first talk with a little story. So without further ado, when God was creating the different animals, he first created the dog. He told the dog, "Look, dog, I want you to sit at your house by the door, and I want you to bark like crazy when anybody goes by or when they try to come in. I'm going to give you a lifespan of 20 years for this." And the dog said, Uh, Lord, that's pretty rough. 20 years of barking? Could you make it 10 and maybe I'll give you back 10? And the Lord agreed. Next, the Lord created the monkey. He said to the monkey, "I want you to entertain people. I want you to do tricks for them and to make them laugh. For this, I will give you a lifespan of 20 years." The monkey, like the dog, said, "Lord, that's quite a gig. To have 20 years to make people laugh and to do tricks for them? Could I ask you to give me a 10-year lifespan and I'll give you back 10 just like the dog did?" And the Lord agreed. Next, the Lord created the cow. He said to the cow, "I want you to go out into the fields, into the pastures with the farmer under the hot sun, and I want you to toil with him and eat a lot of grass. I want you also to have calves, and I want you to provide milk for the farmer's family. And I want you to live a lifespan of 60 years." The cow said, "That's a long time, Lord. Could you cut that down? How about if I have 20 years and I give you back 40?" And the Lord agreed. Then the Lord created man, and he said to the man, "I want to give you a life where you eat, sleep, play, marry, and enjoy your life. And for this, I'll give you 20 years." The man said, Lord, only only 20 years? Could you possibly give me my 20 and then the 40 years from the cow, the monkey's 10, and the 10 the dog gave back? That makes 80, and I think I could live with that. The Lord agreed. So that is why, for our first 20 years, we eat, sleep, play, and enjoy ourselves. For the next 40 years, we slave to support our families. For the next 10 years, we do monkey tricks for the grandchildren. And for the last 10 years, we sit on the front porch and bark at everyone. I enjoy that video because it reminds me of some pretty significant truths about what it means to be human. We live very sequentially from one stage of life to the next to the next. Then all of a sudden, our lives may be a quarter over,
a half over, or God forbid, almost over. And sometimes we forget to have asked ourselves those really big and meaningful questions of what is this all about? What does it mean to be alive? What is the meaning of life? Have you asked yourself that question? What is the meaning of life? That's the topic of our talk today. What is the meaning of life? If someone came up to you on the street and held a microphone up to your face and looked you straight in the eyes and said, what would you say the meaning of life is? What would you say? Do you have an answer tucked away back there? Is it a question that you thought about enough to be able to give any answer with any sort of confidence? What would you say to that? Let's watch a video of a number of people in New York City being asked that same question. You can find a link to the video in our show notes on whatever platform you may be watching on, Facebook or YouTube. You'll find a link there. So why don't you click on that link? It's a man on the street interview. And watch it. It's only a couple minutes long, and we'll be waiting for you when you get back. Just press pause. Welcome back. The question of what is the meaning of life is certainly not an easy one to answer. But we as a human species have been wrestling with it for centuries. It is also not a question just for philosophers and kings, but also for doctors, lawyers, flight attendants, nurses, teachers, construction workers. It's for everyone. Everyone is meant to confront and contend with the question of why am I here, where am I going, and what is the purpose and meaning of my life. It is also a question that will have a profound effect on our lives depending on if we answer it, when we answer it, and how we answer it. In our recent culture, there seems to be a profound and disturbing resistance to the pursuit of absolute meaning. Generations ago, children in elementary schools were encouraged by their teachers to ask themselves about the meaning of their lives. Now in universities, professors encourage their scholars to actively ignore it. I saw an interview recently with famous biologist Richard Dawkins, who claimed that the very question of why was a useless question. Perhaps he was insinuating that any question that could not be answered by the scientific method was unworthy of asking. However, part of what it means to be human is to yearn for that which is beyond our direct and material experience. Look at every culture that has ever existed on this earth. Every culture has yearned for the transcendent.
I would like to take a quick moment to recommend a book to you. The book is The Soul's Upward Yearning by Father Robert Spitzer. In terms of the question about our transcendent nature, I think this book really lays forth a very compelling and enlightening argument about the nature of our human existence and our yearning for the transcendent. Highly recommended.
The question of our purpose and meaning lurks constantly beneath our super busy lives. But we can be awakened to it by encountering people or things in this world which point us to those three transcendents of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Things in nature, for instance, like a beautiful sunset or an amazing starry night. We can also encounter it in encountering a living saint, someone who acts out works of mercy with so much grace. You wonder, where did that goodness come from? We can also be awakened to it by the birth of a child. That's my little girl. She's 3 years old now. We can also be awakened to this question by times of crisis.
Times when we're struggling with addiction, depression, loneliness, or thoughts of suicide. Times when we're burdened by the weight of guilt or shame for some past offensive behavior. Times when we're battling serious disease. or experiencing financial collapse, times in the midst of natural disaster, of hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods. And then there are times of national or social disasters, of terrorist attacks, of global pandemics, of civil unrest, of protests and riots.
Despite facing times of challenge or crisis, or encountering the transcendental realities of beauty, truth, or goodness in people or things in our world, we can still choose to ignore the question that those things inspire in us, the question of the purpose and meaning of our lives. Encounters with the transcendent are fleeting. In times of crisis, they always pass. But the question still remains. And if we continue to choose to ignore it, the most likely result of that decision is that we will try to fill that gaping hole in our hearts, which yearn and hunger for truth, with things that could never possibly satisfy it. Things like power, wealth, success, fame, things like sex, drugs, alcohol, any sort of addiction. Even like an idea of a perfect relationship. If only I had a girlfriend, I would be happy. That's an idol. This is Jim Carrey. He was one of my idols growing up. I thought he was the funniest man alive. I still think he kind of is. He said something in an interview, though, which I found to be very interesting.
I hope everybody could get rich and famous and will have everything they ever dreamed of, so they will know that it's not the answer.
When we continue to choose to ignore the question of what is the meaning of our lives, we are graciously granted what are commonly known as wake-up calls or subjective warning signs to reawaken us to that very important question. I'd like to share with you a little story. Before I became a teacher of theology, I was originally pursuing a career in theater. I was living in New York City. I lived there for about 6 years in a little village up at the north of Manhattan called Inwood. And I used to support myself by working temp jobs. And there was one temp job that I was at for 2 years, a temp job for 2 years, which was soul sucking, and I ended up having to quit. So I was unemployed in New York City. I wasn't making any money. And if you can imagine being unemployed in such an expensive place, you could almost look at your bank account and watch it dwindle slowly right before your eyes. It was very anxiety inducing. And to try and calm myself and ground myself, I would often go to a park right near where I lived. And I would sit by the Harlem River, right where the Harlem River meets the Hudson. And I would sit there. I would often read, I would think, I would meditate. I would try to calm myself. And at the time, I considered myself to be a brooding and mysterious artist. I was very self-obsessed. And I was all about my dreams of fame and having an acting career. I wasn't in a good spot. And at the time, I would spend hours by the river, day after day. And my time there, I would see so many different things floating by in the river. Very often, all of it was trash. I saw everything from spare tires bouncing past me to bags full of garbage to drug paraphernalia. And one day, I saw what I thought was a mannequin. And I remember thinking, oh man, I haven't seen this before. You know, and I stood up and I looked over it. It was only about maybe 4 to 5 feet in front of me. And I noticed really quickly that the mannequin had on Hanes underwear. And I remember thinking to myself, mannequins don't need underwear. Why would they wear underwear? Why would they put underwear on mannequins? And then I realized It wasn't a mannequin. It was floating, in a dead man's float. Because in reality, it was a dead man. And I saw its bloated skin. I saw the hair on the back of his head kind of floating on the water. I saw his veins. And I started to panic, It turns out it wasn't just a dead man, it was a dead boy. This is a picture of him. His name was Tyler Clementi. He was a freshman at Rutgers University. And this was September, so he was very new there. And Tyler, apparently, he was an expert violinist. Sorry. He was an expert violinist, and he moved into his dorm. And his roommate didn't like him. And his roommate also was kind of grossed out by the fact that Tyler was exploring his sexuality his first month in college. And he was hanging out with a boy, and they would kiss in his room. And his roommate one night set up his webcam and streamed to the entire dorm a video of Tyler Clementi, who was still very much, in the closet. He wasn't out. He streamed a video of Tyler Clementi making out with a boy in his room. And Tyler Clementi learned about this very quickly. And that very night, I believe, he posted a small post on Facebook just saying something like, "I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to jump off the GW, the George Washington Bridge." And that was about 5 to 6 days before he floated all the way from the George Washington Bridge up to Inwood, where I lived. And it took him 5 days to float in the water and make his way to there. And seeing him, you can see a picture of him. He was a very slight boy in real life. By the time he came to me, he was quite bloated. I thought he was a heavier man. Like he had the body of a linebacker, it seemed to me when I saw him. And so his story inspired a social movement for the LGBTQ community called the It Gets Better campaign. But his death and my encountering his body inspired in me something very different. Someone who was very self-obsessed, someone who was very nearsighted in terms of what he wanted to do for only himself and not for the world. His death helped me realize that I didn't really want to live life for just myself. I felt like it reawakened in me a desire to help people and to reach out to them and to serve people in their pain and in their hardship. All right, let's move on to our next topic. Death. Right? The great equalizer, as they say. If we think about it, aren't we all just passengers on the Titanic, slowly sliding down its decks, waiting for our own personal plunge into the cold and icy abyss? Woody Allen says, "I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens." Right? It is going to happen to each and every one of us. We don't know how, we don't know when, but it is coming, my friends. It is coming. Here is a quote from my own personal favorite Beatle member.
I get confused when I look around at the world and see everybody running around. Yet no one is trying to figure out what is the cause of death and what happens when you die. That to me is the only thing really of importance, and the rest is all secondary. George Harrison. Here is another quote, this one from Russian author Leo Tolstoy. Is there any meaning in life that will not be annihilated by the inevitability of death that awaits me? Tolstoy's case was, in fact, a very interesting one. A sense of purposelessness tormented him enough to go on a search for the meaning of life. He looked for it in science, he looked for it in the arts, he looked for it in philosophy, and he seriously considered ending his own life. That is until he finally asked some peasants on his estate about what they thought the meaning of life was, and they shared with him their Christian faith, which he eventually embraced as his own.
In facing the question about the meaning of our lives, we come to a sort of existential precipice where we must confront an either or fact about reality. Either everything in reality is on accident or it has a purpose, and that includes our humanity.
Theologian Frank Sheed writes, there are only two ways in which anything can come to be. Either it's intentional or accidental. That is, either someone intended it or it merely chanced. The thing that is intentional has a purpose. Accidents have no purpose. Humanity, like other things, must either be an accident and so purposeless, or else have been made with intent.
If we don't know a thing's true purpose, we might misuse it with unhappy or even potentially disastrous results. Take, for instance, the story of a little boy living down in Daytona Beach, Florida. He was playing in the fields near his house one day, and in the grass he found a live grenade. But he thought it was a toy. It looked like a toy. It felt like a toy to him, so he carried it around with him for most of the day. He didn't know what its true purpose was. Thankfully, his father found him playing with it, gently took it away from him, and turned it into the police. But imagine what would have happened if that kid pulled its plug. If we don't come to understand our true purpose, we will never be able to satisfy the longing in our hearts or to find true happiness or fulfillment. But in order to really discover our true purpose, that sometimes requires a radical paradigm shift in our worldview.
A paradigm shift is an important change that happens when the usual way of thinking about or doing something is replaced by a new and different way. I think it's safe to assume that we're all quite familiar with this logo on the screen. And yet, how many of us are actually aware that there is a secret arrow hidden in it? An arrow, you might say? What arrow? I don't see an arrow. Are you willing to permit a paradigm shift in your perception right here and now? There. You can't unsee that now. You'll notice it for the rest of your life. You're welcome.
And then there are major historical challenges to our perception. Take, for instance, Ptolemy. He was a 2nd century Egyptian astronomer who held that the sun revolved around the earth. And this theory was widely accepted by most of the world that for 14 centuries, that is until the 16th century, when a Polish astronomer named Copernicus came on the scene. And he developed a theory that it was in fact the earth which revolved around the sun. And that theory was eventually proven. Now, we need an astronomical shift in our personal worldview, much like the literal astronomical shift that Copernicus brought into the view of the world. So here is what we propose will bring our lives as human beings into proper focus. It is the person of Jesus of Nazareth who is called the Christ.
There are four ways in which this man, this historical figure of Jesus, brings our life into proper focus. 1. To see our lives as no longer revolving around us. 2, to accept that a God who loves us created us. 3, to recognize that he wants to reveal himself to us through Jesus Christ. And 4, to make the astronomical change of putting him at the center of our lives. Jesus Christ came to us to be the golden key to unlock any question that we might have about the meaning of our lives or our purpose in this world. Listen to the words that he spoke, words that he's speaking to us now. I came so that they might have life and have it more abundantly. John chapter 10, verse 10. I am the way, the truth, and the life. John chapter 14, verse 6. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. Matthew chapter 7, verse 7.
Our first talk in Discovering Christ, the virtual experience, is now almost over. But there might be something else that's just beginning. Whether you've been through Discovering Christ or not, Jesus always wants to reveal himself anew to you. St. James writes in his letter in the New Testament, he writes, "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you." So, make the slightest move toward him, maybe once a day. Call upon God to reveal himself to you in the name of Jesus, and see what happens. Next week, next Monday, will be our next talk. My colleague, Seth, he'll be giving his talk live, and I'm sure it will be awesome. So, thank you for joining us, and have a great week. We'll see you next Monday.